we're moving positive charges out of the cell in the form of potassium ions. Remember, we were electroneutral to start, with a negative ion to match every positive ion on both sides of the membrane. When you take away positive ions from the inside, you're left with an excess of negative ones. Meanwhile, the previously electroneutral solution on the outside has gained positive charges from the potassium, so it now has an excess of positive charge. This means that the inside will be more negative relative to the outside. And since the convention is to define the extracellular voltage as our zero reference point, the membrane potential would be negative. The excess charge doesn't just float around in the bulk solution, however. The laws of physics tell us that these extra charges will move to the membrane. In our example, the excess positive charges would line up on the outside of the membrane, and the negative charges would line up along the inside. Okay, so now we've opened up holes in the cell that potassium can diffuse through, and an electrical potential has developed. What do you think will happen to the intra and extracellular concentrations of potassium if we allow the system to go until it reaches equilibrium?